Hey there, I'm Danny Trester from Trester Tailor in Rochester, Minnesota. This is Tailor It Yourself. In this 4-part series, I'm going to show you how to make alterations to a t-shirt. In this first part, I'm going to show you how to narrow the shoulders, and in parts 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to show you how to take in the sides of the shirt, put darts in the back of the shirt, shorten the sleeves, and put darts in the sleeves, as well as shorten the bottom of the shirt for the hem. To do this, you're going to need a couple of tools. You'll need a scissors, a thread nippers or a small scissors, some thread to match your garment, a ruler, a seam ripper or a razor blade, some wax tailor's chalk, and some pins to do your fittings. You're also going to want a sewing machine, a serger or a sewing machine that has a zigzag stitch, and an iron that can output steam. It's possible to do this process with just hand sewing, but it's not going to look as nice or hold up as well as if it would if you used a sewing machine. Alright, so I've got my shirt on that I'm going to show you how to alter. So for me, this is just a little bit too big all over. The shoulders are broad, the sleeves are long. It's really big on baggy on the sides, and it's a little bit too long for what I like. If you like big and loose, totally cool. Just for me, what I prefer, I just like a little bit more of a fit that's to my actual size. So I'm going to show you how to do all that. First step though is that we're going to narrow the shoulders. If you can see on this shirt, it's the shoulder seams, which are about down here, are a little bit past where my natural shoulder is. So we're going to take the sleeve apart and move that up so that the seam follows where my actual shoulder line is. There's 2 ways you can mark this. One is you can use pins, which I've got here, and the other one is you can use your wax tailor's chalk to draw a line on where you want the shoulder seam to sit. So I'll show you how to do both on each shoulder depending on how you want to approach it. The pinning it is sometimes more helpful because you can actually see, it'll bring the shoulder up so you can see visually what it's going to look like, and that can be helpful. So for this other side, I'm going to take my tailor's chalk. This is a wax tailor's chalk that when you put heat on it, use your iron or a hairdryer, whatever source of heat you have, it disappears. So you can get some other chalks that are actually like a chalk, but you have to kind of brush them off or wash the garment. I like wax tailor's chalk because it comes off really fast and easy. Okay, so to mark this, so I'm going to kind of look in the mirror as I do this. So my natural shoulder line seems to be more about here. So I'm just going to kind of, and I kind of want to keep this where it is. So I'm going to, and this might be a little tricky. You're drawing on yourself. It might not be super accurate. But once we're done, I'm going to take this off, put it on the table, and we'll even everything up before we start taking things apart and cutting it. So then I kind of want to also follow along the back a little bit. So that gives you kind of a general line of where you want it to be. So the shoulder seam is down here, and I'm going to move it just to be about there. All right, I've got this one side marked over here, and I'm going to pin this side. This can be a little bit tricky to do if you're on your own. If you have somebody to help you with it, it's a little bit neater. But once we pin it, if it's not perfect, that's fine. We'll adjust things and make it nice before we cut and measure and do all that fun stuff. But this is just so you have a general idea of how far you want to go with it. So I'm going to take my pin, and you just kind of pull up the sleeve to where you want the shoulder seam to be, right about there on my line. And then you just kind of take the pin and put it in and out of the fabric so it kind of pinches it together. Sometimes you have to do this with one hand. And again, like I said, it may not look the best, but you get a general sense of what it's going to look like, and then you can readjust it when you take it off, put it on your work table. So that, you know, it kind of, oops, I didn't even get that one all the way through. Something kind of like that. And then I can kind of continue on the back. So you can kind of see the 2 different ways. This one, it brings the shoulder seam up to where my natural shoulder line is. I would maybe go a tiny bit further yet. And then this side, we've got it marked. So what happens when we take this off and we lay it on the table, we're basically going to turn these pin marks into that. So if you just mark it, draw it on yourself, you kind of skip this step a little bit. But it will work out either way. So now that we've got this marked out, we will take it to the table, kind of even things out and start the process. All right, so now we got the shirt back on the table and we're gonna even some of this stuff out. We've got our pins over here. We've got our chalk mark over here. So like I said, we're basically gonna turn these pins into chalk marks. But we'll start with the chalked side first. So we got on the shoulder there, I'm just gonna make this a little bit darker and a more solid line. And then I'm gonna kind of ease into the existing shoulder line there, because we're not gonna take this the whole thing off. We're just gonna take a part of it off to maybe about there or so. So you're gonna wanna take the chalk and just kind of smoothly draw a line that shows where we're gonna sew that sleeve back on. So you can kind of see it's a nice smooth transition into the existing sleeve line there. And then we'll flip it over. But this is our mark that we made up here. And we're gonna kind of follow that. So now we'll switch to the side that's been pinned. So I'm just gonna take my ruler and measure where the pin is and double it because it's folded. So it's a 1/2 inch on this ruler, so it's an inch, you know, when you unpin it. So from that spot where the shoulder seam is, I'm gonna measure an inch. And then I'm gonna take that pin out. I'm gonna do the same for this one down here. And that one's at 3/8 of an inch, so I'm gonna go double that, 3/4 of an inch. Take that pin out, and then this guy up here, it's kind of wonky, but we'll kind of average it out. So this one, it looks like it's about an inch as well. So we'll take that one out, and then we'll measure an inch. And I think I remember on that side when I had it on, I wanted to go just a little bit more than what I had pinned it. So I'm gonna double check. I'm gonna go on this other side over here and measure, what do we do on this one? So this one's about an inch as well. So maybe we'll just leave that as is, or we'll do both sides a little bit more, like an 1.25 inches. Maybe that's what I'm gonna do. So I'm just gonna X out that mark that I don't want, and then go back over to this side over here. 1.25 inches, it's about there. And I'm just gonna make this a little bit more prominent here. Scratch out that shorter one. Okay, so now you can see on this other side here that we've got our 3 marks, and we're going to do the same thing as we did on the other side, where we're going to kind of connect them in a smooth line with our tailor's chalk and ease into that shoulder seam. Oops, that's done a little bit too far. It got a little funky on the seams there. So that's our kind of our general line there. Get rid of these pins, and then we'll flip the shirt over and carry our marks onto the back. So we did 1.25 inches just to carry that on, and then we'll kind of let's see, this side was about 1 inch, so kind of a similar spot. We'll do about 1 inch, and then we'll kind of use that as our benchmark to keep tapering into that existing seam there. All right. So now you can see how our shoulders are going to be in a little bit. It's still going to keep the width at the bottom. Eventually we're going to take the sides in and take some of that out as well. But if you're fitting a shirt and you just want the shoulder seams narrowed, this is kind of what it's going to look like. I do this a lot of times on people who have a bigger chest, or ladies who have a bigger bust, where they have to buy a bigger shirt to fit their size through the bust area, but the shoulders end up really broad. This is how you can counteract that. So you narrow the shoulders a little bit so that it fits more to your frame. Okay, so now we're going to take the sleeve apart from the body of the shirt, and I'm going to use my razor blade just because I have a lot of experience with it and it's much quicker. But if you feel like you want to take your time, be very careful, you can also use a seam ripper. Either option is fine, but I'm going to do it with a blade just for the sake of time. So you kind of separate the shirt, pull on it a little bit so you can see the stitching, and then you stick your blade or your seam ripper in there and you just kind of brush it past the threads till they pop, and then you kind of just drag it along. It's the trickiest when you get started, and when you're doing this, You want to kind of angle your seam ripper or your razor away from the sleeve because you may put some holes, frankly, in the fabric because it can be tricky and delicate. But since we're going to be eliminating the shirt portion, because we're narrowing that shoulder, we're cutting that off. It's okay if you put holes there. As you can see, I've kind of separated them there, and I've learned to specifically angle it so that, you know, if the holes do form, it's not on the part that we're sewing back on, it's in the part that we're cutting off. So we'll just continue to go around. And we don't want to go all the way. We just want to go part of the way. So we're going to leave about 1.5 inches from the underside side seam. That we're not going to totally remove the sleeve there. All right, so I'm going to go to about there and I'll stop, and then I'm going to flip and go to the other side. And I'm getting to that point about 1.5 inches from the side seam. I'm going to stop. All right, and there we have our sleeve separated from the body. And now we'll do the other side. And we're getting to that point again, so I'll stop there and then go the other way. And I'll show you, I guess I'll show you a little bit what it looks like with a seam ripper. That does take a little bit more time, but you can still do it. So you want to hook the seam ripper into the stitches and kind of give it a little pull, and it'll come apart. And then we'll just kind of carry along like that. It takes a little bit more time, but if you want to be really delicate with it, this is the way to do it. But if you want to be a little bit more speedy, seam ripper is, the razor blade is the way to go. So you can kind of see, get an idea of how that works. I'm just going to finish up with the razor real quick. And we got about 1 inch, 1.5 inches before we get to the side seam there. All right, so now we've got the sleeves separated from the rest of the body. Before we want to put it back together, we want to mark for our seam allowances along this marking here, and we want to cut off our excess. So if you can kind of see on the previous seam, they had about 1/4 inch of a seam allowance. So seam allowance is from where the edge of the cut fabric is to where you sew it. You always want a little bit of distance so that, you know, the seam stays together. So on this one, I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure 1/4 inch, or you can eyeball it if you're used to this. 1/4 inch from that line we made earlier, and that will tell us where we need to cut our fabric. So I'm going to go all the way around both sides and mark that off. All right, so now we've got that marked out. So now we can cut off our excess. We're just going to kind of start from where we eased into there, and just slowly from the edge, just kind of cut along that 1/4 inch mark we made. Trying to be as smooth as possible, but if it's not perfect, that's okay. So it's gonna be on the inside, and then we'll just make sure we go all the way around, making sure we don't cut anything underneath, and then kind of taper out into the existing seam allowance. And there's our scrap there. We'll just get rid of that, toss it in the garbage. And then we'll do the other side. Okay, so if we lay this out, there you have our little layout there. So yeah, when we do this, we're gonna sew them back on, and you can kind of see how it's just a little bit narrower there. All right, so now we've got everything marked and cleaned up, and we are ready to take this to the sewing machine and put it back together. Before we get going, I just want to note the stitch length should be a little bit longer than you typically would have for maybe some woven fabrics. If you're used to quilting, you want a little bit longer of a stitch to accommodate some extra ease and stretch in the seam, just because this is a stretchy fabric, and then the shoulders are also kind of a stress point. And you also want to try to use a ballpoint needle if you have one. Ballpoint needles can penetrate the fabric a little bit better, so if you notice that your machine is skipping stitches, sometimes switching to a ballpoint needle can help with that. Also, some sharp point needles can penetrate the fabric and put holes in it, so if you use a ballpoint needle, it's a little bit more gentle on some of these knit fabrics. One thing that also happens with when you narrow the shoulders is that it sometimes can make the arm's eye, the circular part of the body of the shoulder, a little bit bigger. So sometimes what you have to do when you're sewing these is you have to stretch the sleeve fabric a little bit more. You don't want to stretch the shirt portion because that's already bigger, but once you put it back together, it's not noticeable when you press it, but sometimes you just want to stretch the sleeve portion a little bit to accommodate that extra width, because we cut some out of there. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like as we go along. We get the shirt flipped inside out, and our orientation is we've got the underside, the side seam under the sleeve there. So we're going to start, we've only taken it, apart most of the way, but we've left this little bit. So this is where we're going to start and stop sewing. So we're going to put the side of the shirt that has the sleeve on the top so that we can see our marks that we made on the body, to have that down so that we could see that as we're sewing. So we'll just start, it'll just tack our seam a little bit, so we'll go forward and back just a tiny bit. Okay, and then we'll line up our seams and everything, clean up our threads. You want to get those out of there before you sew over them, because then it's a little harder to get them out. All right, so we've got our marks here, which is about 1/4 inch from the edge. You can also line up your cut edges together and run them along the line gauge that's on your machine for 1/4 inch if you have that. Or you can line up the cut edges and look at the stitch marks that are in the fabric from where the sleeve was attached before. That can also help you and be a guide so that you make sure that you're not getting all over the place. So like I said, we're going to want to stretch the sleeve, the one without the marks, a little bit more. So we're going to pull it towards us just a little bit and leave this body, the underside layer, as is, so that we can accommodate for some of the extra width that happens when you narrow the shoulders. So I'm going to pull that just a little bit and leave this bottom part as is, lay it down with the cut edges together, and then sew along the 1/4 inch marks there. And every time I stop, I usually try to sink my needle so that the fabric doesn't move around as I'm making adjustments. And sometimes this can roll on you, so you just kind of got to use your fingers and flatten it out. And then again, I'm going to pull the sleeve towards me just a little bit, lay that down, line up the edges, and then sew a little bit more. And in this one, you can see there maybe is I accidentally put 2 little holes. So I'm going to make sure that I get those on the inside so that when we're done and we're doing our zigzag stitch or we're serging the cut edges, that it's encased in there, and that shouldn't be a problem for us. Okay, so I've stretched this a little bit, and then I lay it down. And this shoulder seam here, you see it's kind of going towards the back. I'm going to make sure that I get it going the same way so there's not a little bump there in my sleeve. So I'm going to make sure that's pushed to the back. And again, I'm going to pull my sleeve forward a little bit, lay them together, stitch over it, and you can kind of check your progress. I've hit about where the shoulder seam is, so I just kind of want to look and see how much ease I have in the rest of the sleeve, if I need to pull it a lot more. So you kind of lay the fabric together and you can kind of see I'm doing pretty good. I'm not going to have a big old bump on the bottom. I'm going to keep stretching the sleeve portion just a little bit. And then when you get towards the end, you can kind of see how much you've got left there, and you can kind of line it all up, get it all smoothed out. so that you have one nice continuous seam. And if your cut edges aren't perfect, like I've got this little doohickey there, that's fine. Just make sure that you get it laying nice and flat, and we'll trim that out. All right, and so then we'll just cut our threads after we've back tacked a little bit, and we'll flip it inside out and you can kind of see what we've done. All right, so you can see we've got our sleeve reattached, and that our chalk mark, it's following that line beautifully. We got a nice smooth line. Sometimes if you get a little squirrely, you can kind of see it kind of wavy a little bit, but this looks nice and smooth. We stopped at our stop point there. So yeah, this is looking really nice. If you go all the way around, it follows our chalk marks. It's very nice. Great, so we'll do the other side. Again, we'll flip the shirt inside out. So again, we will go where our old stitching was and line our needle up with the edge of that. And we will tack forward a little bit and back. And then again, we want to line up our cut edges together and be mindful of our chalk marks. And again, we're going to pull the top sleeve portion towards us a little bit to accommodate that wider armhole. And we'll go all the way around. And as I'm coming around, I kind of lay it out and I can kind of see that I have kind of an even amount between the bottom portion, the body portion, and the sleeve portion. So I'm just going to kind of hold them together. And as I come back to the other side, I'm just going to zip right into where my old stitch line is. And then back tack. And now we're ready to secure these cut edges and clean up the inside a little bit. Okay, so to secure and encase the raw edges of everything that we just put back together, we're going to use either a serging or overlock machine, or we're going to use the zigzag stitch on our regular machine. For this step, this sleeve, I'm going to show you how to do it using a serger. If you're not familiar, a serger or overlock is a machine that stitches with 3 threads at once, and it can encase the raw edges and cut the fabric at the same time. After we do this, I'll show you how to do it with a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. But for this one, we are going to take our sleeve, and then where our old stitching was that we didn't take out, we're going to put that underneath the machine, and we're going to lower the foot to keep it secure. And we want to line up our cut edge along the end of the right side of the foot here, and there's also this cutting blade here. We're not really going to be cutting anything off so much, maybe just a couple little uneven parts, but we've already kind of trimmed all that out of there. But you're going to see the 3 threads working at once to encase the raw edges and kind of trim everything off, looking nice and clean. So we'll just sew forward a little bit. And you can kind of see it trims off these little scraps, but it's not anything major. And we'll keep going around. And you can kind of see the look that it has there. It's nice, even, and consistent. We've got the 2 threads, one for the top, one for the bottom, and then one that stitches the edge there. And you want the 2 top and the bottom threads to be evenly meeting on the edge there, kind of wraps around the raw edges. And again, you want to be careful you don't get too far over here, because you're going to cut fabric off, and we don't want to go past the stitching that we've already sewn down for the sleeve, because you're going to see that on the inside, or when you see it when you turn the sleeve inside out, you see it on the outside of the sleeve. And in this instance, I am using a cream colored thread, so you can see what I'm doing, but normally I would try and match the color that is on the garment. So we're coming around to where we started. And there you have a serged armhole. All the edges are encased and it's nice and consistent stitching. So while this step isn't 100% necessary, if you didn't want to zigzag it, if you didn't want to use a serger, that's fine. It'll just give you a clean, professional look on the inside, especially if you're getting paid to do this by somebody else and you really want to put that extra nice touch on it. It's also going to give you a little extra insurance if you end up popping some stitches when you're out and about in your life and you're wearing the garment. Having that second row stitching there is going to help give it a little bit more durability and longevity and keep it looking nice than if you were just to sew it together and keep the raw edges as they were on the inside. But next I'll show you how to do it with a zigzag stitch on your other machine. First thing we're going to want to do is check our stitching and make sure that it is appropriate for what we want to do. And we want to try to maximize the width. My machine I know can't go as wide as my serging machine can. So I'm just going to make it as wide as I can, but you want about 1/4 of an inch width, and then you want about 1/8 of an inch in between the stitches. So I'm going to run this through. And that seems to be about what we want, because we want to go as wide as we can, and then about 1/8 of an inch in between the stitches. So you can adjust your machine. You don't want to go too tight, because if you go too tight, too close in one little area, it'll kind of stretch everything out. So there's a delicate balance there. All right, so now that we're ready to stitch that, we will put our shirt under our machine, and again, we'll start in the area where our old stitching was. And we're going to put the needle so that it's all the way to the right. That way we know where the edge of the needle is going to hit with our edge of our fabric. And we'll just set that down. And we will go forward a couple stitches and then go back to tack it. And we'll just keep going all the way around till we get to the other side, and just making sure that we keep the needle all the way to the right on the edge of the fabric. And if it gets caught up at all, you can lift your presser foot and then smooth things out, set it back down. And you can kind of see how we've got that zigzag going back and forth there. It's not as encasing and enveloping as the serging is, but it again just keeps those, reinforces those edges, and is again another layer of stitching on the inside to have a little bit of reinforcement. And we're approaching our original stitching there, so we'll just kind of go past it a little bit and then we'll back tack. All right, and then just clip your threads. And there you have a zigzag seam there. And I'll kind of show you what it looks like against the serging. You can kind of see the difference between the two. They both kind of do the same thing, but the serging is a little bit more consistent and more coverage there. We had talked about using other needles, and this is an instance where I had a skipped stitch here, and that's due to me using a sharp point needle here. That probably wouldn't happen if I had switched to a ballpoint needle. Again, I had another one there, but not too big a deal because it's on the inside, and for the most part all the stitching is intact, so I think we'll be okay on that score. All right, so we've got our sleeves all cleaned up. Let's take it to the pressing board and smooth it out. When I'm pressing these, I usually like to press the seams towards the sleeve. This side is the sleeve here. I feel like it just looks a little better on the outside if you do that. So we'll just take our iron and using steam, kind of press that. I've also got a sleeve board here. You could do this flat. It just, you might get wrinkles elsewhere if you do it that way. But then we'll just go around, press the seams in. And if you're not sure which way to press them, you can kind of see on the original seams here, these seam allowances are sewn this way. So that can also kind of help you and be a guide for you. Now we'll flip it over and do the other side. This is the side that we zigzagged, the other one was the side that we serged. And we'll just go all the way around. So this will help keep it looking nice and flat, but also get rid of our chalk marks that were left behind. So we're gonna turn it inside out, kind of take a look at it, kind of shake that out. And you can see our sleeve here is nice and smooth. There's no chalk marks. If you find that there's a little lump one way or the other, you can come back, hit it with steam. Okay, we've got our shirt pressed and ready to go. Let's try it on and see what it looks like. All right, here we are. We've got the shirt back on after we've narrowed the shoulders, and you can see that the shoulder seams actually line up with where my shoulder line is. It's, you know, where the joint movement is. So yeah, this is fitting a little bit more for my frame. It's not as broad. I do this a lot on garments where I have to get a bigger shirt to fit the bust, but then the shoulders are too big. You got to take that in. So obviously it's still very big all over the place. We'll take care of that in later videos, but so far I think we've made good progress with the shoulders. And yeah, it's looking a little bit more my size. But stay tuned. Part 2, we're going to be taking the sides in and putting darts in the back to give a little bit of shaping. But thanks for following along, and I hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you in the next one. For more information, including a recommended tools list and downloadable PDFs, you can see the video description below. Thanks for watching, and hope you subscribe.